The Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs will come to order. Today's hearing is a hybrid format. Our witnesses are testifying in person, one of them in person. Thank you for joining us in person, sitting by yourself. And the other four virtually. Members have the option to appear either in person or virtually. For those joining remotely, a few reminders. Once you start speaking, there'll be a slight delay. To minimize background noise, please keep your mute button, click your mute button until it's your turn to speak or your turn to speak. You should also have one box on your screen labeled clock. For those of you joining virtually, you'll hear a bell ring when you have 30 seconds remaining, and then again when your time has expired. If there's a technology issue, we'll move on and try to come back. Our speaking order will be as usual by seniority, back Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat. One thing seems to be pretty much certain in this economy, no matter what happens to most Americans, a financial crisis, a global pandemic, Wall Street finds a way to profit off everybody else's pain. We remember 2008. It was my second year in the Senate. Sitting on this committee, we saw what happened in our country. 9 million workers lost jobs. Worker savings were wiped out. 10 million families lost their homes and everything that went with them. Months and years of mortgage payments, their neighborhood school, the family pet, the stability of knowing where you live, where your kids went to school, maybe even where you'd attend church for the next 20 or 30 years. All that changes when someone is evicted or loses a home. As families watch their dreams crumble, Wall Street, no surprise, found new opportunities to profit from the devastation it created. As families, disproportionately families of color who had been targeted with predatory loans, lost their homes, private equity firms with access to cheap cash were waiting to scoop them up. Following the financial crisis of 2008, private equity funds bought families' homes in cash, often at foreclosure auctions. They bought the loans of the hardest hit borrowers in bulk from FHA and GSEs. Professional investors weren't shy about what made it possible and profitable for them to buy up tens of thousands of homes. They told investors, and these are all quotes, recent turbulence in U.S. housing and mortgage markets created a unique opportunity. The availability of large quantities of single-family homes at distressed prices and strong demand from tenants meant the opportunity for attractive yields. Unique opportunity for attractive yields. What could possibly go wrong for Wall Street? Think about that. In plain English, that meant take advantage of the foreclosure crisis, of course, the crisis that turned homeowners' lives upside down and gutted their hard-earned savings to give Wall Street billionaires the chance to buy up homes for less than they're worth and rent them out at a steep profit. And this is personal to me in the sense that the zip code that Connie and I live in Cleveland, 44105, that zip code had more foreclosures in 2007 than any zip code in the United States. Let's also be clear, there would be, quote, strong demand for tenants because Wall Street preyed on people and cost them their homes. They would have to rent at those higher prices, locking in tenants with no other options for years into the future. The largest investors in the world went on a buying spree, and they shopped strategically. Neighborhoods with good schools in Atlanta, in Phoenix, in Tampa, and Charlotte became the centers of investment. By 2020, just seven cities contained more than half the homes owned by institutional investors. Nobody ever accused them of being stupid. And as some private equity funds were buying single-family homes, another group of funds started targeting, and this is maybe even worse, maybe not, but we'll see, started targeting manufacturing housing communities. There are nearly 38,000 manufactured housing communities around the country, have traditionally been owned by small local companies. The families who live there own their homes, but rent the lot where the home is placed. Many of the families who live in manufactured housing communities are low income and are on fixed incomes. Their median income is $35,000 a year. That doesn't leave room for a rent increase or a broken down car, let alone being able to afford to just pick up, relocate the home they own to a cheaper lot. So when big investors began buying up these communities after the crisis, many of them raised rents, they added new fees, they changed their policies, changed the policies of the previous owner, all without fixing up the communities they promised the residents they would. Residents like Ms. Hook, who is joining us remotely today, In like manufactured homeowners I had met in Iowa a couple of years ago were left with an impossible choice: abandon the home they own with nowhere to go, with literally nowhere else to take their home, or pay rent or try to pay rent they can't afford. That private equity business model has been preying on people since the housing crisis. No one should be surprised that in the turmoil of a public health and economic crisis, Wall Street runs a similar playbook. Today, there are few affordable options in many places. When private equity comes in and buys up homes in their town, renters are often left with no choice other than to accept the rising rent. And remember what in the book Evicted, Matthew Desmond says: the rent eats first. You have to pay your rent before you can do almost anything else. One of the largest single-family rental firms reported record-breaking results at the end of 20. A resource for manufactured home community investors reported that properties just became more valuable. It's a variation on the same theme no matter the industry. They buy up companies like Toys R Us and Sears, lay off workers to show a profit, then close the business. They buy up local newspapers, they fire journalists, and any oversight on coverage of their corporate greed tends to just disappear. They buy up nursing homes, they raise the prices, they neglect residents. It's all the same. Private equity profits depend on squeezing every last nickel from workers and renters without any kind of real investment in their employees or their communities. It's a symptom of one of the biggest problems in our economy. The Wall Street system is not set up to prize long-term investment. Private equity is about the quick buck, everything else be damned. Today we'll look at how these firms have changed the housing market. We'll hear from witnesses about how this hurts pretty much everyone except the big investors. Renters pay higher rent, are forced out. Families hoping to someday own their home are priced out. We'll begin to hear what they need to do to make sure that every family, whether in Columbus or Atlanta or Charlotte, has a safe, affordable place to call home. Ranking Member Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our witnesses. I must say I'm a bit puzzled by today's hearing topic. It seems intended to demonize people who use their own money to buy and even build as little as 1% of the single-family houses in America. At least one of today's witnesses represents a group that rejects the concept of private property altogether, stating on their website as they do, and I quote, "We envision a United States where land and housing are publicly owned," end quote. Let me just say for the record, I think private home ownership is vastly preferable to state ownership of homes. In fact, it's a big part of the American dream. Now, there's nothing wrong with people renting homes instead of or before becoming homeowners, and there's nothing wrong with investors putting their own money to work to meet the needs of renters. Now, if Democrats are concerned about investors crowding out home buyers, then I hope they'd agree that taxpayers certainly shouldn't subsidize loans to investors. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has a different view. The administration lifted existing restrictions on the ability of Fannie and Freddie to buy loans from single-family home investors. That's a taxpayer giveaway. That's why I'm introducing legislation to prohibit the GSEs from acquiring investor property mortgages, and I hope my colleagues will co-sponsor it. Today, what I think we should be focusing on is the $3.5 trillion elephant in the room, the Democrats' reckless tax and spend spree, which includes $300+ billion for housing. Now, billions of this aid is not targeted. Some of these programs have weak means testing and loopholes. Forget about work requirements, even for able-bodied adults with no dependents. They and many people of above-average income will do quite well under some of these programs. Let's consider a few of the bill's particularly misguided housing provisions. Start with the $9 billion in down payment assistance for first-time and first-generation homebuyers. Well, this is rife with problems. First of all, you can qualify even if you or your parents previously owned a home. So much for first-time and first-generation. Second, you don't have to have a low income. A member of Congress could qualify for a taxpayer-funded down payment in Washington, D.C. under this program. Third, there's an invitation to mortgage fraud. A home buyer only has to attest to being a first-generation home buyer. There's no other diligence required. And in fact, lenders are explicitly exempt from liability even if they knowingly accept a false attestation. And worst of all, the program is a thinly disguised attempt to give assistance to homeowners based more on the color of their skin than their financial need, something that's very likely unconstitutional. Democrat Chairman Chairwoman Maxine Waters has said the objective of the program is to help address the racial wealth and home ownership gaps. The director of the Liberal National Fair Housing Alliance has said you cannot address issues of racial inequity if you do not address housing inequity. It is an impossibility. They're so inextricably linked. And thus, the bill text directs the HUD secretary to allocate funds in part based on, quote, racial disparities in home ownership rates, end quote. Now, increasing wealth and home ownership rates among minorities is a perfectly fine goal, but designing race-based policies and benefits is not. The Democrats' reckless tax and spend bill also has $80 billion for renovating public housing. Now, this is a bit odd because the Biden administration requested only $40 billion. So why does the bill have $80 billion? Well, it just so happens that the New York City Housing Authority wanted $40 billion all for itself. But our Democratic colleagues knew they couldn't very well pass a bill that sent 100% of that money to New York City. Might be a bit of a problem for the 48 Democrat senators who don't represent New York City. So instead, Majority Leader Schumer publicly promised to, quote, double down on the administration's proposal and, quote, use all of my power as Majority Leader to secure a funding package that can restore and transform the New York City Housing Authority, end quote. And lo and behold, we now have $80 billion. Not to be distributed using the existing formula, mind you, rather by executive fiat. Certainly looks a lot like Senator Schumer securing a $40 billion earmark, or should we call it the Schumark. So it looks like half of all the bill's public housing dollars will go to a housing authority plagued by scandals, bribery, and chronic mismanagement. It's also distressing to see Democrats pouring billions into outdated public housing projects that concentrate poverty and crime and trap families in generational cycles of dependency and despair. 20 years ago, both parties recognized the flaws in government-controlled housing. That's why Congress capped the number of public housing units with the Faircloth Amendment. Now, the Democrats' reconciliation bill would waive this sensible law so new public housing units can go up. This is a remarkable return to government-owned housing and one that we will once again come to regret. So we need to try something different than big government socialism to help make housing affordable. We need to leverage the power of free enterprise, including private equity, to promote housing for all Americans. To that end, in March, I proposed a set of principles to guide housing finance reform discussions. Since then, the administration has shown no interest in reform and even missed the September 30 deadline to report on its own reform plan. In light of the issues that I've raised today, I hope this committee will hold hearings soon on long overdue topics like housing finance reform and mark up any reconciliation legislation so we have an opportunity to debate and offer amendments on housing policy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. I'll introduce today's witnesses. Sophia Lopez is the Deputy Campaign Director for Housing at the Action Center on Race and the Economy. She conducts research in support of housing and racial justice campaigns across the country. Ms. Holly Hook is an independent author and resident of Swartz Creek Estates in Swartz Creek, Michigan. She became involved with the MH Action in 2019 after the private equity firm Haven Park Capital purchased her community. Mr. Norbert Michel, who is joining us in person, is the Vice President Director of the Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives at the Cato Institute. Michael Hendricks is a Senior Fellow Director of State and Local Policy at the Manhattan Institute. And Dr. Desiree Fields is an Assistant Professor of Geography and Global Metropolitan Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research and writing is focused on housing financialization. Mr. Lopez, or I'm sorry, Ms. Lopez, if you would proceed. Remote.
Chair and Ranking Member of the committee, I really appreciate the invitation to speak with you today about how private equity landlords are changing the housing market. My name is Sophia Lopez. I'm the Deputy Campaign Director on Housing at the Action Center on Race and the Economy. We're a national organization working at the intersection of racial justice and Wall Street accountability. A common claim by the largest single-family rental landlords is that their institutional capital is professionalizing the single-family rental industry. But there are many stories from tenants who are hurt by this so-called professionalization. For example, Dean, a leader at Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia, or Renters United for Justice in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He moved into a Havenbrook home unit and started to see fees pile up, a $10 property administration fee, a payment portal that would crash and trigger 8% late fees, and $25 service fees based on a requirement that Dean had already complied with. Havenbrook alleges that Dean owes thousands of dollars in fees, and despite the threat of eviction, he's fighting back because he knows that these fees are wrong. This is an example of the private equity business model in housing, which enables record-breaking profits even during a pandemic, and it depends on exploiting tenants. This model includes, one, rent increases, and one particularly egregious example, an Invitation Homes tenant in California faced a nearly $800 per month rent increase to over $3,000 per month in rent. This year, single-family rents rose to 13.9% from last year, beating even multifamily rental increases. Second, fines and fees. In 2016, fees and tactics like withholding rent, tenant security deposits generated $26 million in revenue for Colony Capital, and one CEO described the failure to capture fee revenue as, quote, revenue leakage. Third, inadequate maintenance. In Minneapolis, Havenbrook tenants have reported waiting up to a year for essential repairs, including holes in roofs and ceilings, broken stairways, flooding, faulty electrical systems, broken appliances, pet infestations, black mold, and more. Tenants are left to either fix these problems themselves or live in unsafe conditions. Fourth, aggressive pursuit of evictions. Even during a pandemic, Preddy & Partners, the second largest single-family rental landlord, which includes Havenbrook Homes, Progress Residential, and Front Yard Residential, led the pack, having filed 2,000 evictions since mid-March of 2020. And fifth, opaque and confusing ownership structures. Publicly available landlord names are often a string of consonants, numbers, and confusing financial. In addition to that, confusing financial relationships with holding companies and the use of multiple tenant-facing brands make even asking questions an enormous challenge for tenants. Despite the industry's claims that they only make up 2% of the nation's single-family rental market, institutional investor ownership is most heavily concentrated in a handful of markets and neighborhoods. In fact, Memphis, which is 64% Black, has the lowest Black home ownership rate of the 50 largest cities and the highest share of investor ownership. A recent CoreLogic report explains, quote, investors are likely more attracted to locations where tenant rights are far more favorable to landlords, end quote. These landlords are focused on a specific home price range, square footage, and critically quality of school district. Because of the market segment focus, the fact that they have billions of dollars in cash to spend and are willing to buy properties sight unseen, first-time and lower-income prospective home buyers are simply not able to compete. And often new units never even make it to market through arrangements like build to rent. For example, the largest single-family rental landlord, Invitation Homes, and the third largest home builder, Pulte Group, recently announced a partnership to build more build-to-rent communities. It's not a stretch to imagine that in some communities, if you want to live in a particular part of town, in a high-performing school district, you would have to rent from one of these landlords. The clearest fix for private equity's abuses would be establishing comprehensive nationwide tenant protections from exorbitant rent increases, prohibition on excessive fines and fees, just cause eviction protections, and a tenant right to counsel to give tenants a fair shot in defending themselves. This would benefit tenants across all housing types. For example, a set of multifamily developments in New York are currently facing mass evictions by PE landlords, landlords Greenpoint Partners and Carlyle Group in an effort to boost their profits by increasing rent on existing tenants. In addition, there are many avenues to regulate private equity in housing by examining their financing, partnerships and mergers, concentration of ownership in particular communities, and shedding much needed light on where and how they operate. At a minimum, the expansion of private equity into our homes is a moment to create a more transparent housing market where landlords cannot hide behind LLCs and tenants know who the owners of their homes are. Our housing market is rapidly consolidating, and as the largest landlords, builders, and financiers increasingly partner with one another, our communities and neighbors will continue to feel the consequences unless we follow the lead of tenants and housing justice organizers in creating a more just housing system. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lopez. Ms. Hook, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman Brown and members of the committee. My name is Holly Hook, and I'm a resident of Swartz Creek Estates in Swartz Creek, Michigan. I'm a member of MH Action, who are made up of mobile home residents who organize our neighbors and fight to save our communities. Everyone has the right to a safe, affordable home and community. We need the federal government to work with us to ensure everyone this basic right. Right now, predatory investors threaten this human right for millions of families. I bought my manufactured home because I needed an affordable place. In our communities, seniors and families often own their homes, but they rent the land from a common landlord. This creates lower housing costs. We loved our community. Like so many others, it was friendly, well maintained, and walkable. In 7 years, I paid off my house and had reasonable lot rent. It covered land, sewer, and garbage. My neighbors were mostly low-income seniors who retired to our community. Nobody knew our community was for sale until a notice appeared on our doors in July of 2018 saying that Haven Park Capital, a private equity firm, had bought us and our lot rent had gone up 22%, effective in 1 month. I needed answers, but Haven Park only offered an investor site. At the top was a statement, quote, creating stable long-term income. It costs thousands to move our homes. We had two options. We could pay the giant increases or we could just walk away and lose our homes. Haven Park admits this on their investor website by stating, quote, it is difficult for tenants to move their homes. As a result, operating cash flow is among the highest of any real estate class. The rent hikes and fees kept going. Haven Park unbundled administrative fees, school taxes, sewer charges, and trash fees from our rent. Monthly payments rose 40% by June of 2019, and as of this year, they've gone up over 50%. My old lot rent was $310 per month. For just the lot, now I'm paying over $200 more. Our sense of security and independence is gone. Worst hit is the elderly and the disabled who live on fixed incomes. Haven Park now takes most of their income. Some fear losing their homes. Many moved out, including my 80-year-old neighbor who is now in a small senior apartment. And we know of residents forced to use food pantries due to the increases. Haven Park kept raising rents and fees during COVID and sent letters threatening those who couldn't pay in full. They refused partial payments, though the CDC moratorium allowed them. In another Haven Park community across town, a lady named Mary worked 5 jobs to keep up with the increases until she got COVID last spring. Haven Park tried evicting her while she waited for a relief payment. Haven Park only backed off when a reporter asked questions about her case. And let's be clear, these big increases don't come back to us. Haven Park has cut back on maintenance. A nearby community they own lost their water in a storm and they wouldn't fix the pump or the generator in a timely manner. State officials had to get involved after residents went without water for several days. Our communities aren't alone, and Haven Park is not the only actor doing such things. Roughly 2 million people live in communities owned by the 50 largest community owners. Many operate like Haven Park, devastating seniors and families. And now some of the biggest private equity companies in the world are buying up mobile home parks. Outrageously, this trend is fueled by those who say they support affordable housing. We were astonished to learn that Haven Park Capital got their financing through a subsidiary of Enterprise Community Partners, the national affordable housing nonprofit, and Fannie Mae. Both Fannie Mae and Enterprise claim they advance affordable housing, but when they finance predatory investors like Haven Park, they destroy it. We've called on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the regulator, the FHFA, to add safeguards against rent and fee gouging, unfair evictions, and unsafe conditions in their manufactured home community financing. We need financing to support us, the residents, not passive investors. We want financing products allowing nonprofits, public entities, and resident-owned cooperatives to buy our communities and keep them affordable and healthy. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hook. Mr. Michelle, welcome, and thank you for joining us in person.
Good morning. Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. Happy to be here in person. My name is Norbert Michel. I'm Vice President and Director for the Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives at the Cato Institute. The views that I express in this testimony, however, are my own. They should not be construed as representing any official position of the Cato Institute. In my testimony today, I argue that private equity firms or other large investors driven by a profit motive are not responsible for price inflation in U.S. housing markets. Instead, failed federal policies that boost demand are the main culprit. and I'll expand on this argument with three main points. First, the evidence does show that institutional investors have played and still play a very small role in the single-family housing market. Their share of purchases has varied over the last decade or so, but they tend to account for somewhere between 0.1% and 1.5% of home purchases. As of 2019, institutional operators owned at most 2% of the roughly 15 million detached single-family rental homes in the United States, and less than 0.5% of the total number of single-family homes. And while their share is much smaller than that of individual investors, we should not fixate on that share or the share of other investors. We should instead embrace private investors in housing markets and not fall victim to the notion that investing in itself is a harmful zero-sum game, a principle that applies even to housing markets. Second, the share of institutional, corporate, and individual investors combined is extremely small compared to the level of involvement of the federal government. Combined, Fannie, Freddie, and the FHA, just those three, have been behind more than half of outstanding mortgage debt for decades, even before the 2008 financial crisis, and in some years responsible for a share of close to 70%. From 2009 to 2020, Fannie and Freddie's annual share of the total mortgage-backed securities market averaged 70%. Including Ginnie Mae securities, the federal share of the mortgage-backed securities market averaged 92% per year over this period. Virtually all federal housing policies, even those outside of the GSEs and FHA, are geared toward increasing demand. And because housing markets are almost always supply constrained, these policies will consistently put upward pressure on prices and rents. Such policies include providing housing allowances to military and other government employees. I have personally been involved in my own, not entirely tragic story, of having to bid against an embassy employee for a rental home. That individual had a housing allowance that was tied to inflation, and he submitted a long-term lease application that offered to pay an escalating rent each year. And I know from speaking to other real estate agents that I'm not alone in coming up into this situation. And the economic principles are exactly the same for other types of assistance and subsidies that pay for housing. They place upward pressure on prices. And my third and final point is that the Biden administration's housing policies, as well as many that are being considered in the budget reconciliation process, only double down on these types of failed federal policies from the past. They too will artificially boost demand even more than we're used to in the housing markets, thus promising to make price inflation worse and waste more taxpayer money. These policies move the U.S. housing market further in the wrong direction, which means towards less affordability. And the following list provides just a few examples. $10 billion for first-generation down payment assistance fund, $80 billion to create new public housing projects, $72 billion for the Home Investment Partnerships Program, $10 billion for a new housing investment fund, $75 billion for Section 8 rental housing vouchers, more than triple the current level of funding. And the partial list of items in my written testimony includes $4.5 billion just for HUD, or for the HUD secretary to, quote, implement and oversee the programs, many of which already exist. That figure alone represents an 8% increase for HUD's fiscal 2022 budget. The main problem with all of these policies is that they boost demand while doing nothing to address supply constraints, and more tragically, while doing nothing to address the underlying economic and social issues that make it difficult for people to earn income and build wealth. We should expect nothing from these policies but the same poor results that they have produced in the past. Thank you for your consideration. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Michel. Mr. Hendricks is recognized remote. Mr. Hendricks.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to participate in today's hearing. My name is Michael Hendricks, and I serve as the Senior Fellow and Director of State and Local Policy at the Manhattan Institute. And I have to say I agree with Ranking Member Toomey that today's hearing topic seems misguided. Large investment firms, including those in private equity, buy just 1% to 2% of homes sold nationally, and they own less than 0.1% of the housing market in America. In short, big finance is a tiny player in housing. But housing is a hot market today, and investors, both large and small, are seeing opportunities to invest. So I'm open to discussing how these private dollars can go to expanding access and affordability for Americans looking for a place to call home. Yet many in Congress are embracing this administration's plan to regulate and legislate their way to a bigger government role in housing. For instance, the reconciliation bill being considered now doubles down on failed public housing and throws more subsidy money at a limited supply of homes, a recipe for prices to keep rising. These are not answers to America's housing crisis. Housing demand is far outpacing housing supply. But the roots of this crisis lie not in financial speculation, but in government regulation. Localities have made it practically illegal to build enough homes to meet demand, leading to inflated prices. Yet this hearing suggests a skepticism for private sector investment in more housing and more housing supply. And if not the private sector, then that leaves us with a public sector, specifically public housing. That would be a mistake. Rather than helping the private sector to solve the government's crisis, Congress plans to bail out America's failed public housing system. This money has few limits in how it's spent. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has promised to hand over the bulk of these dollars to the scandal-plagued New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA. Back in April, Senator Schumer called on President Joe Biden to double his planned spending of $40 billion in public housing. He wanted all of the original money just to pay NYCHA's repair bill. And he got it, an increase to $80 billion in spending on public housing, an enormous influence in securing half of it for a NYCHA bailout. Here's the reality. NYCHA is what we get when we get more public housing. And that should scare every American, especially for the survivors of public housing. NYCHA is the nation's oldest and largest public housing system, housing more people than the city of Atlanta, and long held up as a model of what government can achieve when it takes charge of housing. And in 2018, NYCHA's own tenants sued the Housing Authority for its squalid living conditions. Then the federal government sued too, finding that the housing agency had worked harder to cover up its, quote, dangerous problems than to actually fix them. Turns out that the nation's largest and greatest public housing system poisoned over 1,000 children with lead exposure, then lied and covered it up. Sometimes more money means more problems. Despite record levels of funding, quote, New York's public housing isn't getting better, admitted the New York Times. A public housing slush fund only harms accountability and leaves structural problems in place. Spending $40 billion to repair NYCHA amounts to roughly $250,000 for every family living in public housing in New York City. Do we really believe we won't get more of the same? Bailing out scandal-plagued public housing authorities like NYCHA is not the answer. Neither is condemning private sector solutions to America's housing crisis. It's time we did better for Americans in need of affordable housing. We must do better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hendricks. Dr. Fields, you're recognized for 5 minutes, remote.
Thank you, Chair Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Desiree Fields, and I'm Assistant Professor of Geography and Global Metropolitan Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. My research considers the intersection of financial processes, housing, and digital technologies. A particular focus of my scholarship is the role of institutional investors as landlords. I examine how single-family rental homes have become the site of new financial asset classes, the organizational forms and growth strategies common to institutional landlords, and the critical role of technological advances in the institutionalization of single-family rental, or SFR. Single-family homes have always been a meaningful share of the U.S. rental housing sector, but before the 2008 financial crisis, the market was highly fragmented and largely opaque to institutional investors. This all changed in the wake of 2008. Large pockets of discounted but newer homes were available in suburban Sunbelt markets. Mortgage credit was also constrained, and rental demand was rising. Together with new information technologies, these market conditions allowed investors to aggregate ownership of single-family homes, efficiently coordinate management, and develop structured finance opportunities in SFR. Today, what began as an opportunistic trade has evolved into a full-blown industry. Individually and through their lobby group, the National Rental Home Council, SFR operators position themselves as strengthening communities and creating solutions to America's housing crisis. While compelling, this messaging doesn't fully capture how private equity landlords are changing America's housing market. nor how the new round of investor-led growth since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic may deepen these changes. The ways private equity landlords are changing the housing market is linked to the geography of corporate SFR. The industry's messaging, as we've heard today, is that they comprise just 2% of the SFR market, but institutional landlords do not acquire properties uniformly across the country. To achieve efficiencies of scale, they have focused on suburban Sunbelt markets hit hard by the 2008 crisis, concentrating especially on Florida, Georgia, Texas, North Carolina, and Arizona. Furthermore, they do not search uniformly across all single-family homes in their target markets. Investors use a specific set of neighborhood and built environment criteria, and they limit their acquisitions to properties they can purchase near or below median prices. This segmented geography sheds light on how corporate landlords have been able to increase rents so dramatically during the pandemic. Amid the generally heightened demand for space and amenities seen during the pandemic, a flood of capital into SFR is enabling institutional investors to outcompete would-be homebuyers in their target markets, channeling them back to renting and generating spillover demand for SFR homes. Thus, while SFR operators claim to provide quality, affordable housing, they have in fact pushed outsized rent increases on tenants, especially during the pandemic. Rent increases by the largest operators have ranged as high as 15% on new leases in some markets. Corporate landlords are also creating new fees and ancillary services on top of rent as a way of driving up revenues. In addition to the implications of institutional SFR for housing costs and homeownership opportunities, we should consider their wider consequences. Corporate landlords advance a rhetoric of reinvesting in distressed communities and strengthening neighborhoods. This rhetoric is contradicted by their behavior, which indicates they put investment priorities ahead of community stability. Large SFR owners are more likely to file for eviction than mom-and-pop landlords, and they are more likely to use aggressive serial eviction filings as a rent collection strategy. They also employ specialists to petition for property tax reductions, seeking out cost savings by minimizing contributions to the local tax base. Finally, institutional operators use their financial clout in the political arena to organize against efforts to expand tenant protections and to support politicians who are friendly to their interests. These examples show how the SFR industry wields power that has implications for the public beyond the tenants who actually live in their properties. In closing, I would like to emphasize that institutional investors backed by private equity have already changed the housing market. Their behavior has potentially far-reaching social and economic consequences, but so far they have effectively shielded themselves from meaningful public scrutiny and responsibility. As I hope my testimony makes clear, institutional landlords enjoy outsized power and influence in our housing market, and it is vital to intervene with research-informed policies that support tenants, homebuyers, and communities. Thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Fields. We've heard testimony today about private equity firms buying up manufactured housing communities and homes across the country and how residents, because of that, suffer. Start with you, Ms. Hook. When Haven Park and other private equity firms buy a community and raise the rents, what sacrifices have you and other residents had to make to keep your homes?
Yeah, it's quite bad. In my community alone, a lot of senior citizens on fixed income, they get $800 a month. I know one woman who has to go to a food bank on occasion now. There's another community north of me where people have had to band together and start utilizing food banks because of the rent increases. And I know of the other community right across town, this poor woman was working 5 jobs trying to keep up with these rent increases. And I know a few seniors just in my community alone where they've had to go back to work and come out of retirement. You know, they have hip problems, back issues, they can't stand for very long, and they have to go back to working in a grocery store in order to keep up with these rent increases. I've also heard reviews where senior citizens and people with health issues have had to choose between paying these heightened rent fees or paying for medications that they need.
Thank you, Ms. Hook. Ms. Lopez, what are some of the most problematic elements of the private equity single-family rental business model?
Thank you for the question. As I enumerated, I think that rent increases are a particularly damaging impact. I want to begin, I guess, by focusing on the people who actually live in these homes today, who've reported these immense rent increases. I was reading that Invitation Homes actually just this year announced that they would be increasing rents by 8% for tenants who are planning to renew, and 11% for tenants who are coming into new vacant properties. So that's a fairly dramatic issue. I would add on top of that fines and fees. As I mentioned in my testimony, this is a primary revenue generating strategy for these companies, and it's really across the board and has been pretty well documented. Inadequate maintenance for sure. I submitted in my written testimony a story of one tenant who said that there was flooding in her home in the basement, covering an outlet, so standing water covering an outlet that had been improperly installed by her landlord, Havenbrook Homes. And as the water rose over it, she was told that in order to turn off the electricity to diffuse an otherwise hazardous situation, she'd have to do it herself. And this just fits with the pattern of what I've heard from tenants again and again, this attitude that tenants need to fix these kinds of things because no one's going to come fix it for them. And then I would also touch on these aggressive eviction practices, which Dr. Fields also mentioned, in the interest of making sure that these private equity-backed companies are able to meet the obligations of the kinds of financing that they take on. Evictions are paramount, and these companies have to be aggressive in pursuing them. Otherwise, they risk the tool that allows them to procure and acquire more of these homes in the future.
Thank you, Ms. Lopez. Dr. Fields, we hear that these big investors only own the estimate 1 or 2% of single-family rental homes nationwide. We know in some regions the percentages are much higher. Where are these investors buying homes, and why are they choosing these communities?
Sure. So the geography of the corporate single-family rental market largely tracks with the markets where the housing bubble before 2008 was the largest and where price declines were the steepest afterwards. So some of the top areas for these major single-family rental operators include Atlanta, Phoenix, Tampa, South Florida generally, and then the Dallas-Fort Worth region. And investors are, they're using acquisition engines or acquisition algorithms in order to zero in on the properties that meet their investment criteria. They're typically looking for 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, single-family homes priced at the mid-range of the local market. And Invitation Homes, for example, is looking for homes that average about 1,800 square feet with 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms in attractive neighborhoods in infill locations that have proximity to major employment centers, desirable schools, and transportation corridors. In other words, I would suggest that these operators are competing directly with would-be home buyers and owner-occupiers.
Dr. Fields, thank you. And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I've just a few seconds on. Ms. Lopez, Dr. Fields mentioned algorithms and technology. What are your thoughts about that, how investors use technology to buy and manage homes around the country? Ms. Lopez?
I appreciate that question. What I find fascinating is that some of the same private equity companies who invest in actually acquiring the homes also invest in the technological advances that allow them, and platforms very specifically, that allow them to purchase more of these homes. So I would say that there's an interesting interplay between this field of iBuyers that exists. So Zillow is an example, Redfin is an example, Open Door, and OfferPads. And actually there's been an increasing interplay between some of these iBuyers selling directly to institutional owners. And for me, I see all opportunity for the acquisition of homes to rapidly accelerate because of those technological advances, because of the investments in the technology themselves, and also the needs of companies on both sides. It's a partnership that's geared toward consolidating the market even further.
Thank you. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Public housing is a failed model of delivering assistance. Let's face it, it's costly. It traps families, often in multi-generational cycles of poverty. A generation ago, by the way, there was a very broad bipartisan consensus to move away from public housing. In 1998, Congress voted with overwhelming bipartisan support to cap the net number of public housing units. Senator Durbin even referred to public housing as, quote, vertical slums. So that cap is still in place today. Such is the durability of this consensus, but our Democratic colleagues now want to eliminate that cap And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, and I think Mr. Hendricks did as well, Senator Schumer in particular appears to have effectively added $40 billion for this shoe mark to public housing in order to bail out the New York City Housing Authority. So my question for Mr. Hendricks is there really a justification for the New York Housing Authority getting half of all of this money? For instance, does the New York City provide half of all the public housing in America? Is the New York City Housing Authority one of the best-run public housing authorities in America that deserves the additional resources? Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Thank you for the question. There is, in my opinion, no justification for rewarding failure. NYCHA has failed as public housing and has failed to keep its residents safe. New York's progressive public advocate has named NYCHA the city's worst landlord for 3 years straight. The only justification for spending $80 billion in public housing is that New York wanted $40 billion. Senator Schumer promised to double support for public housing, even though NYCHA's share of public housing nationwide is only 20%. So half of all public housing funding, potentially even more, but only 20% of housing. And they'll take more if they can get it. Now, no doubt NYCHA has problems. It is falling apart, but a no strings attached slush fund, I believe, is not the answer. How can Congress trust NYCHA to safely house families when the families can't even trust the agency? We should be embracing private sector solutions to America's housing crisis, not doubling down on NYCHA.
Thank you. Mr. Michel, one of the concerns I have is the lack of means testing, or at least the lack of sufficient means testing, and a almost complete lack of work requirements in many of the housing provisions in this Democrat tax and spend bills. One of my concerns is the effect this is going to have on the incentives to work. What are your thoughts on the effect that these programs will have on the incentive to work and the ability of people to build a middle-class life? And if we could do that briefly, because I do have one more question.
All right. It will continue to destroy it, as that's been going on for decades now, well over 50 years. It becomes part of an open-ended assistance system that literally destroys the incentive to become a productive member of society. It creates and perpetuates a subculture, if you will.
And if you undermine and eliminate the incentive to work, you really undermine the ability to work your way into the middle class, it seems to me.
Yes, when I say that, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Eliminate the incentive to build a career and build wealth.
Exactly. So this is both for Mr. Michel and Mr. Hendricks. So it seems there's no question housing prices have been going up. It's been going up actually very dramatically across the board. If you ask me, the monetary policy that we've been pursuing that has driven up the price of virtually every asset class I can think of, from commodities to energy, equities, crypto assets, real estate generally, that's a big part of this. Let me ask you both briefly, and I apologize, I know there's not much time. What could we be doing that would be a constructive way? Let's assume we got our monetary policy right sometime in the reasonably near future. What could we be doing to increase the availability of affordable housing?
Well, we have to stop increasing demand. You have supply-constrained markets in housing all the time, and all federal policy is geared toward doing is making it easy to get a loan and increasing demand. There's no way that policy ends in anything other than higher prices. And the way that we do that is primarily through Fannie and Freddie. So we have got to shrink their footprint. There's no way around that.
Mr. Hendricks, did you have anything you wanted to add?
But couldn't agree more with my fellow witness. We have more money chasing after an ever-vanishing supply of homes. We need to get the supply of homes increased. We need more private sector investment. Investing in public housing is not the answer. Having more government money chasing after an ever smaller supply of homes is also not the answer.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Toomey. Senator Tester is recognized from his office remote.
Yeah, I've got a question for Ms. Hook. But before I start on that question, I just want to say that housing across this country has increased because of demand. And if anybody on this call has a way that we can increase demand so that houses become more affordable, and what role the government can play in it, I'd love to hear it. Because quite honestly, unless you're making a lot of money right now, you can't afford a house in this country. And so we got a huge problem out there. We got businesses that can't start up. We got businesses that can't expand because there's no workforce housing. There's no housing for people who make regular wages. Okay? And if we don't wake up to what we're going to do, and I do not believe the government should be building houses, but I will tell you this, shrinking Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and doing away with the 30-year mortgage would be insane. Okay? Just want to get that off my chest. All right, Ms. Hook, I want to thank you for being here today. I want to thank you for your story. I have unfortunately heard similar stories from folks in Montana facing challenges, I believe, from the same same private equity firm that has impacted your community in Michigan. So could you expand from your testimony on what transition ownership was like for you and your neighbors? How, when this happened, what did it do? How much did your rent go up? And did any of the benefits of your rental agreement change for the better?
Thank you very much for your question, Senator Tester. What happened when we changed ownership is we residents had zero say in who our park was sold to. We just received notices taped to our doors saying, hey, we're Haven Park, we're happy to clear your community, and we're going to increase your rent. At the time, it was about a 22% increase, which was about $70. My original base rent was $300 just for the dirt that my home sits on. And immediately it jumped up to $370, which for me at the time, I'm a writer. I don't make a ton of money. And that was actually a pretty big increase for me at the time. And for the seniors in my community on Social Security at fixed income, it was even worse because a lot of them, they can't go back to work and raise their income like I can work harder and make more money.
That's right. So are you familiar with resident-owned communities?
I am somewhat familiar with resident-owned communities. I know my friend in Montana who lives in Great Falls was pursuing that option. You may have heard of her. And we know that there's not very many resident-owned communities right now. I know Rock USA specializes in resident-owned. And what we would like to see out of Fannie and Freddie is more funding for resident-owned community options so that residents can purchase their own communities and run their own communities and ensure that all investments and rent actually goes back into the community and making conditions better for all residents. But unfortunately, these private investors come in and they pay such a high dollar for our communities that we can never afford to buy them back. So it effectively closes the market to us, and pretty much they own the entire local market because they tend to buy groups of communities.
Yeah, and I don't care what percentage it is. If you live in one of those communities and your rent is jacked up and continues to be jacked up, and you have no way to increase the amount of money that you're making other than working 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 jobs, as you pointed out in your testimony, the street becomes the option, living on the street. And for a country that had the rich history that we've had and a vibrant middle class that we have, to put folks from that middle class out on the street is something we should be very, very concerned about. And make no mistake about it, I have lived a very good life. I've been able to pay my bills without having to work 3 or 4 jobs. I've worked 2 most of my life, but 3 or 4. But if you're put in a situation where your fixed costs are going up, especially if you're on fixed income, you don't have a lot of options. There's not a lot of options out there. I want to talk to Dr. Fields for a second. Dr. Fields, the private equity firm that has bought some of the manufactured home places have also bought multifamily housing in Great Falls in particular, and maybe in other communities within our state that I'm just not aware of. They bought apartment buildings, and it is similar problems that have arisen with the renters. The rents have been jacked. To the point where people are having to make decisions that, quite honestly, are not reasonable. And in fact, HUD-badged vouchers in some cases are no longer effective for a number of reasons. So what more do we need to do? I'm talking about the United States Senate, Congress, the agencies out there to make sure that those HUD-badged vouchers aren't taken advantage of in these private equity transitions.
Sure, thanks for the question. Yeah, certainly I think the kinds of rent increases that you're describing are common, whether we're talking about single family rental homes, apartment buildings, manufactured housing, and that's because investors are really trying to deliver returns to their investors and to pay back the debts they've taken out to finance their portfolio acquisitions. In terms of what the Senate can do in order to ensure that HUD vouchers, can actually cover the costs of housing in communities controlled by these types of investors, I do think it's important that that we do think about housing as a public good, even if we don't have the government involved in building new housing and owning new housing. The fact is that that these investors are providing a good that everyone needs in order to survive. And if they're able to take out huge credit facilities and deliver returns to investors and pay themselves, there's no reason that they wouldn't be able to keep rents at a moderate level that would ensure that people can actually use their housing vouchers.
All right, thanks, Dr. Fields. I pass it off to my friend Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Senator Tester, and thank you all for being here. I know this hearing is supposed to be about structural issues and housing, but Mr. Hendricks, I want to go back and touch on Nietzsche. We have our friends on the other side of the aisle on what I believe is a spending spree to redistribute massive amount of taxpayer dollars, $80 billion to public housing. Half of this total, though, $40 billion, has been earmarked by Senator Schumer to go directly to New York. In fact, he publicly said he will use all of my power as majority leader to secure a funding package that can restore and transform Nietzsche. Half of $80 billion. It would believes that the American tax is to funnel money to New York. Long history of sex scandals, bribery, general incompetence. So, Mr. Hendricks, how does $40 billion compare to Nietzsche's usual budget? Mr. Hendricks? Mr. Michel? We'll try to see if the committee staff have a comms problem, but.
Sorry, I do not know their annual budget. Sorry.
Well, I think that the Democrats' $80 billion funding total is equivalent to $85,000 for every family in public housing. We'll see if we can get Mr. Hendricks back online, because I would like to cover some of this. But while we're waiting, I wanted to talk about the landscape. Again, we're here talking about under the pretense of examining efficiency of the national housing market. Yet the target, in part, has been on private equity businesses and really private housing enterprises writ large. But they own an exceedingly low portion of the nation's housing stock. 85% of single-family residence homes are owned by individuals and small proprietors. 22% are in the rural markets. Institutional ownership of single-family housing rentals accounts for about 0.19% of the U.S. housing market. So if we're trying to find a way to provide better housing, more affordable housing, one of the things that I think that our committee should focus on, and I saw this when I was Speaker of the House in North Carolina, are the obstacles to building affordable housing. Regulatory overreach. Waters of the U.S., that's one of my favorites because it brought a bipartisan opposition in my state of North Carolina at the city, the county, and the state level because it was artificially inflating the cost of housing, hurting the people that this committee, I think, wants to focus on. We're creating an artificial the institutional investment to state market. I don't know, but I don't think it's a disturbing number now. Mr. Michel, do you have anything to say about that?
Yes. So I'm from New Orleans, and I'm familiar with some regulatory issues.
I lived in Westwego.
Okay. So the entire metropolitan area is essentially wetlands, yet wetlands. So that's a problem, and that's still going. It is a supply problem. It is not a demand problem. And what we've done with federal policies,
we're at about a 60% low for new housing starts. Is that right?
Somewhere between 50 and 60, I believe that's correct, yes. Yep. And at the same time, we're continuing to increase demand. Mm-hmm. That can only end one way, and that makes housing less affordable. And the houses themselves are less affordable, which also does impact rents. So it's a two-pronged problem on that side of the market.
I just recall, and then I'll turn to Senator Warren, but back shortly after I became Speaker, who wanted me to provide minutes talking about affordable discussion at the state to workforce housing, a number of things that we need, rural areas, urban areas, they're all in need. In the last 15 minutes, they pitched me on the idea of giving them local authority to require that every new single-family home be mandated to have fire suppression systems, sprinkler systems, which for a $100,000 house would probably increase that house by about 10 or 15%. But that's the sort of mentality that we have to get past if we really want to get to a point to where we're producing affordable housing and we're reducing the regulatory barriers that are the real cause, or I think a substantial cause, for why we continue to have the challenges that we do. On behalf of the chair, I turn to Senator Warren.
Well, I appreciate that, but I think we are not connected with our folks online. Is that right? We are connected? We are not connected. So we're just going to adjourn temporarily? Recess. That's right, we're not adjourning. Recess. Thank you. I'm glad one is a
I apologize to our witnesses. Looks like we're having some sort of technical issue with the recording studio. Can you guys all hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
I can hear you now.
Yeah, it looks like the audio that's going through the recording studio isn't being pushed out through. Can you hear it in there? Very low. Oh, it's low. Okay, that's good. Okay. I'm just going to make a couple calls, try to get this sorted out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is an important hearing for us to have. Yesterday, in my Economic Policy Subcommittee, witnesses discussed the damage the private equity industry has done to communities across this country. It's good that we're continuing this discussion today, specifically in the context of housing. Manufactured or quote unquote mobile homes are a critical avenue to affordable housing for millions of Americans. A few decades ago, these communities were generally owned by mom and pop businesses, but the private equity industry saw an opportunity. Residents of manufactured home communities often own their own homes, but not the land underneath. And since most of these homes aren't actually mobile, Wall Street vultures realized that families were effectively stuck in place, sitting ducks. One of these vultures is a private equity-backed company called Hometown America. In 2006, Hometown purchased a manufactured housing community home called Oak Hill that is home to 175 resident families in Attleboro, Massachusetts. Now, Ms. Lopez, from what you've seen, when private equity or other Wall Street firms purchase a manufactured home community, does the quality of life for residents of that community generally improve?
Thank you so much for the question, Senator. No, I mean, what's typical from my experience when private equity purchase housing, whether it's mobile home parks, single family rentals, multifamily properties, they typically follow the same playbook. Rent increases that tenants are hit with, impossible new fees and fines, and maintenance usually almost always deteriorates. And in this case, because tenants have bought their own trailers, as you mentioned, it's really expensive, if not impossible, to relocate. And absolutely, that's a quality that they're banking on.
Yeah. So when companies like Hometown buy up these communities, they have responsibilities, legal responsibilities as landlords, like responsibility to maintain the property. And this is particularly important for the residents at Oak Hill because the home sites in this area are subject to flooding. So, Ms. Lopez, from your experience observing how corporate landlords behave, do you think that Hometown was proactive in making the repairs to make sure that residents have quality living conditions?
I don't know the specifics of the situation, but based on all of the patterns that I've seen, I think it would be highly unlikely.
Well, you guessed right on this one. Hometown implemented a policy that specifically put the burden of these repairs on the residents. And yet at the same time, Hometown increased the rents so that they could further pad their own profits. Now remember, as you say, most of these homes are not on wheels. So the residents have to choose between either paying the higher rent or in some cases just abandoning their housing. Nobody should be surprised that the private equity industry is forcing residents to make this choice and doing it just so that they can pad their own profits. Private equity firms get rich by loading companies and real estate they buy with debt, then stripping out all the assets, extracting whatever value they can, and charging exorbitant fees. That is the business model. And for communities like Oak Hill, this means increasing the rents, refusing to make home repairs, and squeezing every penny out of the residents that they possibly can. Ms. Lopez, what does Congress need to do to ensure that residents at Oak Hill and other manufactured home communities across this country aren't being gouged by private equity firms?
I appreciate this question. To me, the most effective way to stop private equity abuses, as I mentioned in my testimony, would be a comprehensive set of tenant protections that would safeguard against things like exorbitant rent increases, excessive fines and fees, providing just cause eviction protections, and also a tenant's right to counsel to protect against the worst parts of what you're describing. On the other side, there are many ways to begin to regulate private equity. I think the Stop Wall Street Looting Act is an excellent piece of legislation that starts to take away some of the ability to take on excessive risks in ways that harm tenants and workers. But I also think that taking a look at the financing that these companies engage in, the mergers and acquisitions that they engage in, and the ways in which they geographically target are all ways that we could begin to develop legislation that takes on exactly the role of private equity in housing.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer, and I think you're right. There are a lot of ways that we can approach this. I very much appreciate your mentioning my Stop Wall Street Looting Act, because it would fundamentally reform the private equity industry and end its most predatory practices. That would leave the residents in Oak Hill and other manufactured home communities safer from Wall Street's clutches. So I'm going to keep working on that one. I'm looking forward to getting some help on it. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Smith from Minnesota is recognized from her office.
Thank you very much, Chair Brown. Thank you for holding today's hearing. This is an important issue and something that is directly affecting the lives of my constituents in Minnesota, as large institutional landlords have increasingly been buying up swaths of previously affordable single-family homes in Minnesota. There are a number of concerns that I've heard from my constituents about this. And I know that Ms. Lopez has cited some specific stories from Minnesota renters in her opening statement, but I'd like to just share a couple of other examples of what I've heard from my office in Minnesota. Shanika Henderson, for example, says, starting at the beginning of the pandemic, Havenbrook stopped responding to repair requests in my home. The basement leaks during the winter and has ruined many of the items in my home. In my home, there are issues with the porch falling in, electrical issues, broken steps, broken windows, screens that are broken. I've been reporting many of these issues since October of 2020, she says, and had to do many of the fixes myself. And then one more from Jimmy Harris, who described heat not working and, quote, a large hole of dirt around 3 feet tall in the basement where a rat has come through, leaving an infestation. And these are just some of the concerns that I've heard. Mr. Chair, I ask that the full statement from Renters United for Justice be entered into the record, as well as a Minneapolis Star Tribune story describing the situation more fully.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much. With these concerns in mind, I have a question. It's something that I discussed with Julia Gordon, who was the nominee of the Federal Housing Commissioner nominee a few months ago. So many of the properties that we are talking about today were acquired by institutional landlords through bulk sales by federal agencies after the 2008 financial crisis. So that got the properties off the books of the federal government, but it concentrated them in the hands of large institutional buyers. So I'd like to ask Ms. Lopez and then Dr. Fields, what do you think that we should be doing to level the playing field for ordinary home buyers so that large institutional buyers don't end up buying the large bulk of the available properties in certain regions, areas?
Thank you so much for the question. I'm happy to answer. You're absolutely right in your characterization. And actually, from what I've seen, there are actually plans to revisit bulk sales. So HUD actually has a proposed bulk sale coming up, if I'm not mistaken, in November. And from what I've seen, there's been some discussion of ensuring that half of those properties make their way into the hands of community organizations. I personally would like to see a higher ratio of those properties end up in the hands of community organizations and not in the hands of the kinds of landlords that I described in my testimony and that you shared stories of just now. I think that's one start. I think there are a lot of other opportunities, unfortunately, as people exit their mortgage forbearance periods, that we'll start to see more foreclosures. And I think we do need to think very seriously about how to make sure that those end up in the hands of more homeowners, that people never lose their homes to begin with, and that least of all, they go to these particular kinds of landlords.
Thank you very much. Dr. Fields, I'd love to hear your response to this too. And it seems to me that it's virtually impossible for individual home buyers to participate, to compete in this bulk marketplace, and that puts them at a distinct disadvantage in terms of being able to make sure that these homes stay in single family ownership.
Thank you for the question, Senator. So I would like to mention that I think most of the large-scale single-family operators that are active today and that are the largest players in the industry, most of them did acquire their homes not through bulk sales, but through individual transactions. It is certainly true that investors have taken advantage of bulk sales, including fix and flip investors, and some rent-to-own schemes that have not turned out so well for the people trying to purchase homes. So I think it's an issue, although not exactly within my core area of expertise. However, I do agree with Ms. Lopez that I think it's important to ensure that bulk sales, that we can level the playing field for bulk sales. And I think increasing the proportion of properties that can go into the hands of community-based organizations, and particularly community land trusts, would be incredibly important, because community land trusts do keep housing permanently affordable over the long term, and it really represents a very sustainable use of public funds. And the other thing I would say is that we could consider policies such as a cap on the assets under management of these large-scale investors as a way of potentially breaking up some of their monopoly power in the markets where they have the largest footprints. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Senator Smith, if you have another question or two, feel free, because we're Senator Warnock is about to get back. But if you have another question,
I do have one more question,
okay,
and then when Senator Warnock returns, I'm happy to cede back. And my question is about property maintenance. Many of the concerns that I've heard from Minnesotans are around maintenance issues. And too often it seems like these single-family rental properties are being mismanaged. We've heard stories about that today by landlords that are thousands of miles away that are clearly focused on squeezing profit out of these properties and not focused on building strong communities. Pretium, which bought Havenbrook Homes earlier this year, says they're trying to make up for past institutional owners' mismanagement. And I mean, I hope that they're right, but so far, Minnesotans just don't seem to be seeing any improvement. And even if there are new owners, even if these new owners are able to address these problems, it doesn't address the fact that the incentives for institutional buyers are simply never going to be aligned with building strong community. So I wonder, I'll come back to Ms. Lopez and Dr. Fields. What should policymakers be considering as we think about how to align property acquisition and property management incentives with what we, with what we need to accomplish so that communities aren't hurt by these large property owners?
I deeply appreciate the question. I would say, kind of starting with your characterization, I completely understand this dynamic where a newer company has come to acquire some of the homes, and there's this challenging situation where tenants are dealing with poor maintenance issues. To me, the thing that would be most beneficial are comprehensive tenant protections, including a right to counsel to allow tenants to be able to fight back in situations where landlords' legal obligations to tenants aren't being met. I think that there are also some aspects of expanding perhaps what some of those legal obligations actually are. So understanding the relationship between tenants and landlords as one of consumers, right? And if a consumer isn't actually getting what they're paying for, there has to be some kind of way that they can seek a redress for that. I would also say, though, that in a situation like this one, what seems important to me is actual opportunity for this particular landlord to talk to the tenants who are being impacted. I know that's something that the people in Minnesota have been asking for some time, and it hasn't happened. And I think given the statements of Pretium in particular, they'd have an interest in actually having that conversation if, as they say, they plan to address some of those longstanding issues.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Warnock from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chair, for holding this important hearing on housing. And thank you for the way you have consistently emphasized that this is a committee not just focused on banking, but we're also focused on housing and the concerns of ordinary people. That work is so critically important. We're in
Senator Warnock, one of the reasons I wanted you on this committee, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you kindly. Well, we are in the middle of a housing crisis, and we have seen it so clearly in Atlanta and in the state of Georgia. And it's so important that we understand how private equity affects the marketplace so that we can find solutions for ordinary people. Private investments in housing is a complicated issue, and it's important that we understand it correctly. Professional investors are less than 1.16% of the national single-family rental market, a little over 1%. However, as Dr. Fields has already pointed out in her testimony, private equity landlords do not acquire properties uniformly across the country. In Georgia, over 5% of all homes are owned by single-family rental home companies, well above the national average. And in Atlanta, 3 companies, Invitation Homes, Tricon, and American Homes for Rent, own 21,727 properties, which is 70% more than the size of their portfolio in any other city. Dr. Fields, could you speak to the effects of this targeted private equity investment on the housing market in cities like Atlanta, and what guardrails have states or local governments successfully deployed to protect tenants in these homes or to protect individual home buyers looking to compete with private investment companies to purchase a home in today's market?
Thank you for the question, Senator Warnock. Starting with the last part of your question first, unfortunately, I don't think we've seen a terrible amount of intervention by state and local governments, either in support of tenants of corporate landlords or in support of home buyers who are being outbid by these investors, which is why it's so important that we're having this hearing today. In terms of the kinds of consequences that we see for the housing markets where institutional investors have the largest footprints, we've already discussed many of these consequences. So the rent increases in places like Atlanta, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Tampa have all been above 10%, I believe as high as 13% on new leases in Atlanta in the past year. So we're seeing very rapid increases in rent. We are seeing, the rollout of new kinds of fees that tack on extra costs to the cost of rent every month. And I think especially important to point out, in addition to shutting out home buyers from wealth creation while creating more demand for themselves, we're also learning that corporate landlords evict tenants and file for eviction at much higher rates than smaller scale landlords. And this often works as a strategy of intimidation against tenants, and also fosters further housing insecurity by adding late fees, attorney fees, and other costs onto rent arrears, right? So I think overall the picture is one of increased costs and housing insecurity for tenants and diminished homeownership opportunities for people who are in a position to buy. And I think, just to add on a little bit to some of what Ms. Lopez was saying, in addition to comprehensive tenant protections, I think we should also look at things like supporting tenant associations for these large-scale landlords. In many cases, because they're living in single-family homes, tenants are often atomized from one another, don't have any way of communicating with other tenants who rent from the same landlord and might be experiencing the same problems. And I think supporting tenant associations and perhaps even collective bargaining rights for tenants of large-scale landlords would go a long way towards easing some of the power imbalance that tenants face in this market. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's critically important that we understand the impact of private equity on the housing market. You speak of rents being unaffordable and home ownership out of reach, which is why we've tried to offer some policy solutions. My down payment toward Equity Act is an effort to address some of this, but there's a lot more that we have to do. So thank you so very much for your insights.
Thank you, Senator Warnock. I apologize to the witnesses. Because we've had 3 votes today, the attendance has been down, and I know a lot of people had questions, but I think we're going to adjourn the meeting. We've had some misinformation in today's hearings. I want to just clear up a few things. The percentage of homes private equity owns in the whole country really doesn't tell us much. These firms aren't buying properties evenly across the country, as witnesses affirmed. They're buying in large volumes in a targeted group of communities and a targeted group of neighborhoods within those communities, as Senator Warnock has seen in Atlanta, one of the centers of this. If you want to rent a home in the neighborhood where your kids go to school in Atlanta or Columbus, you don't have a lot of options. So that's a lot of power for one single big national Wall Street firm. I think we all tire of this idea that would, quote, that this talk would take away the incentive to work. We know people in this country want to work. The incentive to work is pretty basic. It's same for people in the middle class and people aspiring to the middle class as it is someone in upper income brackets. It's to make enough money for your family. The idea that someone who's low income has some kind of pathology where they wouldn't want to work to make more money, all because they got a $300 a month tax cut, the child tax credit that Senator Warnock and I and others have worked on, the biggest tax cut for working families in this country in history, or they've got help finding an affordable apartment. It's pretty ridiculous, and frankly, saying that they don't want to work is pretty offensive. Work unites all of us. That's why I talk so often about the dignity of work. It's why Dr. King and Pope Leo sort of invented the term, to do something productive for ourselves and our family, because all work has dignity. If some of my colleagues are so concerned about some Americans missing out on that inherent dignity, I'd suggest they look a little harder at the wealthiest sliver of the country making millions off investment income. Often much of it, pardon me for saying this, often much of it inherited. Perhaps we could attach a few work requirements to their tax breaks. The Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs is adjourned.